The nascent planet of Abir Torel has braved the tempest of primordial battles called the Dawn War and the life-eradicating cold of a devoured sun, all during a time known as the Shadow Epoch, surviving by the will of the earliest gods in the pantheon of this burgeoning world. Now basking under the warmth of a renewed star, new lands arise, emerging from the melting ice as diverse forms of mortal life gain their forever foothold upon this world. With a concept of time and the establishment of calendars, we embark upon an age spanning 5,000 years to discover the origins and fates of these, the creator races of the Forgotten Realms. These are the Days of Thunder, and while you may have heard this story before, today you will discover obscure details, mythic legends, and hidden lore you likely have never known before. Our definitive exploration, a grand history of these Forgotten Realms, continues right now on Riches and Liches.
Welcome adventurers, scholars, and world builders. I'm Rich, and this is Riches and Liches, dedicated to dungeons, dragons, and tales of lore. Hopefully you are joining us having watched Volume 1 in this series on the grand history of the Forgotten Realms, as today we emerge from the time before recorded time of the Blue Age and the primordial Dawn War to enter the Days of Thunder, an age lasting 5 millennia and covering a critical time in the realm's past. Two quick notes before we get rolling. First, some errata. In Volume 1, I incorrectly labeled the primordial Ubteal the Deceiver as also an Elder Evil. I've long had a bad habit of using the labels primordial and Elder Evil interchangeably, which is not at all accurate. But Ubteal was indeed a primordial, but not an Elder Evil. Dendar the Night Serpent, also featured in Volume 1, is an example of being both a primordial, and in this case, also an elemental Elder Evil. So while it's certainly possible to be both, Ubteal was most definitely not. My apologies for the mistake, and a sincere thank you to RPG Horror Stories for pointing that out in the comments. Not my first mistake, won't be my last. The perfect volume likely eternally eludes me. But you know what? I love the back and forth anyway, so it's okay. And second, I went into this series pretty confident I had a firm grasp on the lore of this age, and I had planned to cover all the Days of Thunder in just one volume. However, my research netted far more lore than I had anticipated, including a lot of alternative mythologies, some really cool legends, and divergent lore that is all quite fascinating, and I just couldn't bring myself to cut any of it. One of my biggest gripes with lore coverage, especially in this medium, is not presenting all the knowledge, all the mythologies, and all the conflicts, including the often competing theories, so that you have all the knowledge available. By Wizards' own official statement, we must remember nothing from any past version is canonical unless it's in a 5e book. While that's unfortunate to hear, it really only impacts world building if we let it, and this makes having all the knowledge that much more critical. At the end of the day, I'd rather be thorough than fast, which means this age is going to be broken into 2 volumes as we simply follow along with the chronological timeline. So today we'll cover the first 4,000 years of this age, and then in Volume 3, we'll cap off the Days of Thunder with those very active final 1,000 years. There is some upside here, however, as I'm going to go ahead and throw down the gauntlet and say you're going to have a really hard time finding more thorough coverage on the Days of Thunder anywhere else on YouTube. I'm just that confident that many of you are going to find something in these next 2 volumes and the series at large that you've not heard before. I know I certainly did. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get to the lore. Our continued look at the history of Ed Greenwood's fantastic Forgotten Realms setting and the age known as the Days of Thunder. As we move out of the Shadow Epoch and into these earliest Days of Thunder, the first important historical note is the advent of time. And it is here that I will start by adding some clarity to the overall historical timeline we are working with in this series, based upon a few comments received on Volume 1, where I mentioned we're covering a span of 35 millennia over the course of this series, which in actuality is both inaccurate and a bit misleading. So I want to clear that up by asking you to keep in mind that the 35 millennia, or 35,000 years, is just the known record since time was conceptualized and dates were historically recorded. And canonically, it's actually somewhere between 35 and 37,000 years, of which actually only starts in this, Volume 2, right at the inception of the Days of Thunder. In fact, the timeline covered in Volume 1, while wholly untraceable because the concept of time was not yet divined by the gods who, as immortal, let's face it, have little use for such contrivances. Nonetheless, it spans what I would estimate, with an educated guess, as potentially billions of actual years. So hundreds or even thousands of millennia, not 35, due to the liberal use of the word eon in the canonical source material. So while not definitive by any means given the historical period and the variable use of the word eon itself, the Blue Age, Shadow Epoch, and Dawn War we profiled in Volume 1 may have covered billions of years, and regardless, certainly covered far more than 35 millennia. So with the series timeline established, along with the first known recording of historical dates, this makes it a good time to provide a brief summary on the origin and our use of the Dale Reckoning calendar for this series. There exists a litany of calendars available across the Forgotten Realms, and this wide variety of competing and often conflicting calendars has frustrated many a historian and sage. The recording of years are actually done through the passing of the winter seasons and are referred to by various names, where each kingdom or city-state numbers these years differently, usually performed as a measure of the reign of a dynasty or a monarch, or even to demark the founding of a country. The result of these variable forms, needs, and uses is what ends up as a hodgepodge of conflicting calendar systems that only serve to confuse the common and infuriate the sage. So it's vital for consistency that one picks a calendar as a standard, and this series is no different. For the entirety of these volumes, and generally for the channel at large, when referring to the Forgotten Realms, we'll be using the DR or Dale Reckoning calendar. While certainly not the first, the Dale Reckoning calendar is the most widely accepted among scholars and historians today. The Dale Reckoning begins at the year of sunrise, known as 1DR, and marks the unity of humans and elves. It was at this time that humans were first permitted by the Elven court to settle in the more open regions of the forests of the realms. In recognition of this historical agreement between the Corminthir elves and the humans of the Dale lands, a standing stone was erected as a symbol of that unity and signifies the early rise of humans upon the lands. You might find in some writings, primarily those which do not have direct ties to Dale lands history, that Dale Reckoning is sometimes referred to as Freeman's Reckoning or FR, but just know that they are used interchangeably. I would also note here that I have often seen the standing stone being referenced in the plural. Heck, I've probably done it myself in the distant past, but it's a single standing stone, and it's located in the forest of Corminthor, just south of Myth-Dranor. Beginning around negative 35,000 DR, Dale Reckoning, Abir Torel would start a 5 millennia long age known as the Days of Thunder, witnessing a great thawing of the icebound planet to reveal a contiguous supercontinent known as the Meroboros. Upon this new land, life now bloomed, taking forms that would shape the very ancestors to many of the beings that fill the pages of the monster manuals of Dungeons & Dragons today. These were called the Creator Races, and while history will tell us that there are 5 such founding species, just 3 of them will leave their imprint upon this world at this early stage. The Sarrukh, the Batrachi, and the Aari. Each built empires vast and strong, and it's their stories and legacies I'll share with you today. The remaining 2 Creator Races have profile stories, but they come much later in our timeline and therefore will be covered in a future volume. These are the Fae, who at this time have departed the realms to rule the fairy domain, eventually becoming the Feywild, but will be responsible for opening up these forgotten realms to the first elves settling upon the planet a bit later in our series. And then we have the last of the Creator Races, not without its own controversy, the humans. Far and away the most primitive of the so-called Creator Races, certainly at this point in our timeline, they would not play a significant role until much later. It should be noted here that many additional intelligent races lived on Abir Torel at this time, And it is only through the eyes and writings of later scholars, many of which were in fact human, that their own ancestors would be given such an elevated title as one of the creator races, presumably due to their eventual accomplishments, an irony not lost on many elves, dwarves, and the like. This at least suggests a likely explanation for why we have the unlikely inclusion of these very primitive, ape-like humans at the omission of such races as elves, dwarves, halflings, and gnomes, not to mention the more savage races such as gnolls, orcs, and goblins, who, depending upon your source, were either not known at the time, not native to the planet having eventually immigrated to the realms, or excluded due to conflicts in reconciling a desired yet biased narrative based on the ancestry of those who wrote the historical record. An inarguable example of this would lie in the exclusion of the giants as a creator race. Giants not only existed during this time, but were clearly a dominant race, certainly more advanced than the cave-dwelling humans who barely had the use of the most primitive of tools at the time. While the 5 creator races I listed are the most prevalent, they are not undisputed. In fact, there are several 2nd edition sources, namely the Powers and Pantheons official sourcebook, that adds dragons as an original creator race at the expense of the Aari, who are not even mentioned. Most modern-day scholars, in what can only be seen as a bit ironic, dismiss this as a biased claim of dragonkind. However, the preponderance of contrary evidence does suggest that the dragons did come a bit later, a subject we will be delving into quite deep as we cover the dragon origin lore, as well as that of the giants in a near-term future volume. Still, as a matter of the historical record, it's important that you're aware of the alternative theories, biased as they may be, that still exist. I believe it's important to the accuracy of our efforts to chart the history of the realms that we also review the origin theories for those additional races that fall out of the accepted criteria of the creator races. To that end, I will likely add a volume at some point in this series to showcase the origins of the many other distinguished races for your consideration. With that minor editorial out of the way, we can now provide a more in-depth look at the first of the 3 creator races that were prominent, dare I say dominant, in this age, along with the rise and fall of their empires and the indelible legacies they left upon our history. As the dawn of intelligent life across a myriad of races began to carve out their place upon this world, one species in particular rose tall among the rest to claim their legacy as the first great empire of Abir Torel. These were the Sarrukh, also known as the Saurians, and they would dominate the lands for 1,500 years. This intelligent, ancient reptilian race were the progenitors of the Scaled Ones, a modern term used to categorize the sprawling tree of life from which so many species have come to be. While you have likely heard the parroting of the Sarrukh as ancestors of the Yuan-Ti, the Naga, lizard folk, and troglodytes, in actuality the Scaled Ones make up a roster of creatures, monstrosities, and intelligent humanoid life that eclipses 100 species. Some of the notable but lesser known of these include the kobolds, the asabi, the kahasta, the basilisks, and the kuatls. The dawn of the Sarrukh Empire started in the arid plains and deserts of an ancient land you may know today as Durpar, in a region called the Shining Lands that would many thousands of years later fill tomes with its stories of barbaric tales, enslaved kobolds, and the rise and fall of another great empire, the godless Emaskari. It was here in these flat plains wrapped by the mineral-rich bay of golden water that a revolution in agriculture would change the course of history. This race of intelligent reptilians began domesticating livestock. This allowed the rise of semi-nomadic herders who drove their flocks between seasonal pastures, allowing ample resources to foster a modest growth of the Sarrukh populace. However, the eventual overgrazing that resulted led to the erosion of these plains, forcing the Sarrukh to seek new, more fertile ground. This forced migration leading the burgeoning creator race to a region of savanna they called Okoth. Encompassing a region that included the massive freshwater lake Azul-Dulf and fed by the eastern tributary of what was later called the River of Swords, Okoth would quickly become the first of their many empires. Here, with the advent of the first permanent farming settlements that soon followed, Okoth became the epicenter of a spectacular growth spike, with many settlements growing to support several thousand inhabitants as the Sarrukh quickly outpaced all other races upon the realms. Today credited with many world firsts that assisted them in their rise to dominance, the Sarrukh are known as the inventors of animal domestication, farming, and the first written language of the realms. There are many who would also say that the Sarrukh were the first mortal life to use magic upon this world, a supposition that some might contest, namely the Fae, or possibly any number of the primitive tribes that they may have claimed that secret from, something I will touch upon in the next chapter. Regardless, the Sarrukh, recognizing their early dominance, began veering down a more sinister path as their armies spread rapidly throughout much of the known realm, conquering new lands, enslaving their enemies, and planting the seeds of rapid expansion as they went. While they did encounter limited pockets of disorganized resistance from the more primitive races that inhabited the lands, these Saurians, as the first species to emerge from the Dark and Stone Ages, entered into their Iron Age, empowering their forces with bronze, iron, and eventually steel to levy absolute dominance over the other races upon these lands. With these significant early advantages, the Sarrukh advances went mostly unchecked, conquering and settling nearly all the known realm within a single century. As part of their rapid expansion, many other races were voluntarily or involuntarily incorporated into the Sarrukh empires. And through conquest, enslavement, controlled interbreeding, and according to some theories, possibly even magically enhanced genetic engineering, one lasting legacy the Sarrukh have left upon the realms is the vast racial diversity among Faerun's scaled and serpentine races. This fact might also serve as an early indicator, an omen if you will, a portent of things to come. It is in this legacy that sentient beings such as the Yuan-Ti, Naga, lizard folk, and many others owe their very existence, albeit indirectly, to the Sarrukh Empire. However, one of my favorite origin theories involves the Kuatls you might be familiar with in modern-day D&D, where we have some evidence that strongly intimates the first of these winged serpents were created by transforming a group of Sarrukh dissenters who broke from the Empire as they continued down a dark path of evil. Breaking from the expansive Sarrukh empires meant leaving the realm for the plains, where these good-aligned but exiled Sarrukh entreated and served the creation deity Jezerian. Among the many empires that would follow in the wake of Okoth's rise, two stand out in history, those empires of Mahershalk and Issos-Tefafil. The Mahershalk Empire rose in -34,800 DR on the Chultan Peninsula, and the Issos-Tefafil Empire followed 300 years later in -34,500 DR, based in what is now the Great Desert of Anauroch. Other realms of interest within the Sarrukh Empire included Sistar-Tissan in what is now the Forest of Worms. Built as a temple city by a dark Naga cult of Sharstrun, its most notable feature of the time were its many ornate fountains with its waters told to hold magical properties, giving the city an alternative name as the City of Fountains. Of these ornate springs, one is purported to hold special provenance, the fabled shrine of cowled serpents, where legends state that the fountain's arcane waters would confer spell-casting benefits to those who bathed in its waters. And then we have the city of Illimar, which was founded by a minor clan of Sarrukh whose members served the empire as the fortress city for the intake and distribution of captive enemies from the Sarrukh expansion and conquests. These ancient prisoners of war would then be shipped to both Issos-Tefafil and Mahershalk to fill various roles of servitude within those empires. Digging even deeper in the lore of Illimar, I found an interesting legend from the 3rd edition that tells us of 3 Illimari Sarrukh who are said to have been in hibernation since before the Drow conquest of Dambrath, where they still lie buried amidst the Illimari ruins. The historic pace of conquest and expansion of the Sarrukh is a remarkable feat, the likes of which the world would never see again. Indeed, the Saurian Empire's dominance over the realm really cannot be overstated. But questions long persist among modern-day scholars on the actual mechanisms at play that would allow the Sarrukh as nothing more than one of many primitive and savage early races to advance so fast and so far beyond their contemporaries. While some posit this was solely the circumstance of their innate intelligence and good fortune, after all, someone had to rise first. Other scholarly reviews, however, attribute their early dominance, at least in part, to their alignment and worship of an obscure entity referenced in their surviving texts as the somewhat ambiguous World Serpent. While the true nature and identification of this World Serpent deity may be lost to time, many prevailing theories suggest many different names tied to this dark entity. These include the Naga goddess, Shekinnister, the Yuan-Ti deity, Mershal, Escilus and Simiwana, both deities and demigods of the lizard folk, and even Imdas, the snake mother and demigoddess of serpent folk. Even more obscure and theoretical, some claim the World Serpent was actually the mysterious and lore-bending primordial-turned god Asgaroth, who will come to the fore of our discussions a bit later. And yet still others suggest the World Serpent is but another name for the Kuatl deity Jezerian I mentioned earlier, who I covered in an alternative creation mythology you can find in the 9 Hells series. However, after poring over at least a half-dozen texts, myself and many others have come to a more likely, more reasonable theory, that the World Serpent is but a conceptual manifestation, intended to embody fragments of all deities that represent the diverse makeup of the Sarrukh Empire, all coalesced to provide each species a familiar and relatable representation and form for them to worship. Regardless of its true identity, most sages do believe, however, the World Serpent deity to have some influence through gifts of divine knowledge for advancing these reptilian ancestors through the Dark Ages, and may have potentially also played a role in the Sarrukh evolving the very first forms of mortal magic. Piecing together this fragmented history from literally the dawn of both time and mortal life itself is rife with lost knowledge and anecdotal evidence that require speculation and theory in order to fill in the gaps. Through this process, we can begin to paint the origin story of ancient magic in the realms, the very first sparks of the rites and rituals that predate even Mystra's weave. Faerun scholars theorize that as the Sarrukh civilization expanded, they discovered and claimed many types of ritual and tribal magic craft, those practiced by various shaman from the many primitive races of the realm. The Sarrukh, in their expansion and conquest, gathered and studied these practiced sacraments and ceremonies. Upon finding they had a natural affinity and a strong acumen for these ancient arts, perhaps augmented by the divine blessings of their World Serpent deity, the Sarrukh dedicated their best and brightest to pore over these mysterious charms and incantations, consolidating their discoveries into a series of writings. These texts, which contained obscure but fundamental principles of magic, were then brought to Orome, the capital of Issos Tefafil, for study, where the most gifted among the Sarrukh and even their servitor races continued to analyze and experiment, advancing their grasp of this mystical secret knowledge of the universe. Many years later, upon completion, these writings were used to create the golden skins of the World Serpent. Those early Sarrukh sages were also the genesis of a secret organization called the Be'ateth that would continue long after the fall of the Sarrukh empires. However, the contributions from those golden skins helped establish the foundational knowledge on which the Be'ateth was formed. Located south of the Nether Mountains in an ancient forest of dense woods called the High Forest lies the Hall of Mists, sometimes historically referenced as the Citadel of Mists. Situated just north of the Lost Peaks deep within these woodlands, this stronghold was established by the Batrachi Empire as the headquarters for the Be'ateth and their secret studies to advance the work of the Sarrukh sages. While the Be'ateth stronghold lies in ruins today, much of the knowledge we know is taken from the poems and stories told by the bard Mentipur Moonsilver, specifically his Part 9 story entitled Hall of Mists, which regales us with its tales of the elves locating and warding off this Vault of the Sages many millennia later, dated around negative 12,500 Dale Reckoning. In reading about the Aravandar elves' actions upon their discovery of the secret stronghold, including their summoning of the Grandfather Tree to guard and ward off this arcane hall, and then placing it deep beneath its roots, one has to wonder what secrets or powers were found within to cause such a response. Nonetheless, it was this arcane fortress that is believed future Beoteth sages from not only the Batrachi but also the Aari continued to evolve and update the insight gleaned from those original golden skins, allowing the creation of the earliest tomes of arcane knowledge, the end results of which would become one of the most important and influential of all artifacts in the Forgotten Realms. Believed lost with the fall of the last Aari empires during the time of dragons, but discovered many millennia later by the Netherese people, these Beoteth works have evolved into what are today known as the Nether Scrolls. While enigmatic and shrouded in mystery to be sure, the Nether Scrolls now exist as a set of 50 scrolls divided into 5 chapters of 10 scrolls each, some lost once again, others guarded zealously. Each scroll is made with precious metals of gold and platinum, yet flexible as parchment. They serve as the very foundation and basis of arcane knowledge in use today and are a subject well worth their own dedicated volume of study. It is important to reinforce here that this discovery of powerful but obscure ritual-based magic existed before even the divination of the weave itself, and has a complicated and intricate but most certainly interesting relationship with the lore. Discourse and discovery regarding the subject of magic in a time before the weave is always fraught with conflict and speculation. Although we most certainly have countless written accounts of its presence in this time, leaving little doubt, the general consensus is that its nature was far more difficult, dangerous, and ritual in form, meaning the casting was likely very complex and quite time-consuming, generally far removed from the more disciplined use of the arcane arts in the modern-day form we know. Yet it is the opinion of this narrator that those ancient and tribal magics are not only complementary to Mystra's weave, but also serve as the foundation of our understanding of the weave, allowing us to harness its powers, undoubtedly an important milestone in the history of the world as we know it. While certainly dominant for nearly a millennia, as the Sarrukh civilization expanded, it also drifted towards the sinister concept of conquest, with servitude or slavery being the only outcomes in their later interactions with other races. Over time, this myopic and short-sighted view eventually led to the Sarrukh actually becoming a minority race in their own kingdom. While a myriad of other races fulfilled their needs and satisfied their every desire, the Sarrukh enjoyed all the luxuries of a civilization at its height. But as history has taught us time and again, their increasing dependence on their servitor races and their growing indolence formed foundational cracks that would mark the beginning of their end. The Sarrukh leaders clearly never read or heeded the advice of Roman statesman Marcus Tullius Cicero, who said, "Never go to excess, but let moderation be your guide." Indeed, Okoth was the first empire to fall, collapsing around negative 34,100 DR after a century of civil strife that drove many Sarrukh into exile. Istasephafil would stand strong for another 300 years, until approximately negative 33,800 DR, when, during a war with the Underdark aberrations known as the Farim, the city leaders directed their mages to reroute the narrow sea to flood the Underdark. While this successfully pushed back the aberrant creatures, the historic writings tell us the resulting climatological changes that followed doomed their domain. Mahershalk was the last to fall, a victim of nearly a century of rebellious strife and inner turmoil amongst the stronger of the servitor races, eventually overthrowing and killing or exiling the Sarrukh leaders as the Yuan-Ti took control of the empire in negative 33,500 DR. One notable but obscure fable from the Sarrukh legacy found in surviving written text claim the Sarrukh mages discovered a technique of permanent transformation magic affecting the forms of other live creatures and eventually of the Sarrukh themselves. The key word for this fable is the word permanent, as even today's modern arcane arts cannot boast such power. While this claim is nothing more than mere conjecture, as the ability, if true, was lost to the death of the last Sarrukh. Or was it? You see, while the Sarrukh empires have long crumbled to dust, many credible sources claim that, while most certainly exceedingly rare, the Sarrukh are in fact not extinct. Another claim that is bolstered by the legends I will share in the next chapter of this volume. So, should you ever come upon a tale of a strange, unidentified, serpent-like humanoid, you might do well to investigate and study with pen before sword, as the Sarrukh still hold many untold secrets. As we close out our profile on the Sarrukh, it is the fables, legends, and tales found in the footnotes of their history that I find most interesting. Although most of the Sarrukh died in the wake of the collapse of their great empires, there exist some truly legendary tales regarding the fates of those that did survive, hidden in obscure texts and ancient writings. The first of these legends states that the remains of the great clans of Okoth, numbering several hundred strong, wandered the outlands following the empire's fall. This nomadic existence hardened them, slowly corrupting and eventually turning them even farther into evil. Seeking to once again grow dominant, their eyes fell upon a race of humanoids with a passing resemblance to that of the lizard folk the Sarrukh had conquered so many times before. However, these were not lizard folk, but instead the violent and far more savage Kahasta raiders. As the legend is told, the Okothian clan made their final mistake in attempting to enslave the Kahasta, the resulting battle wiping these remaining survivors from the face of the realms. I was actually very excited to run across the Kahasta in my research for this volume. I had forgotten all about these might-make-right, brutal, lizard, savage hybrids, but now I recall running into them on a few occasions during some planescape adventuring days of old. And I've added these to my list of obscure creature types that I'd like to dedicate a volume on someday. If you find them interesting or have your own story to share about the Kahasta, be sure to let me know. This next legend is actually my personal favorite of the three I'm going to share today, and I bet you'll figure out why shortly. The tale involves the last surviving Sarrukh of Istosefafil. As their empire crumbled around them, it is said that less than 100 remaining Sarrukh, comprised of their leaders, families, and most powerful mages, secretly retreated into a large subterranean stronghold that lies in the hidden catacombs deep beneath the ruins of Orome, assisted by an unknown number of Asabi, an evil reptilian race of creatures said to have been a genetic creation of the Sarrukh. These Asabi and the generations they spawned over the millennia were fiercely loyal to their creators, and it is said that to this very day they maintain a powerful and ever-vigilant defense of the Sarrukh stronghold against any intruders, erasing all remnants of their discovery to ensure the secrecy of their existence. But that's not even the best part. To make this long-term arrangement even feasible, the legend continues that 60 of the most powerful Sarrukh mages succeeded in the process of lichdom, where they still dwell ruling the underground tomb, although, as the legend is told, only one of these 60 liches is awake at any given time, while the remaining sleep safely in the crypt of dreaming lizards. How's that for a unique and canonical future adventure? And we finally come upon our last legend, incomplete in its canonical form and just screaming for an ending. The remaining Sarrukh of the last empire to fall, Mahershalk, roamed the Forgotten Realms until faced with starvation, at which time they devised a survival strategy that involved a cycle in which 1,000-year hibernations alternated with only brief periods of activity, during which time food gathering and procreation could take place. And canonically, well, that's it. Yeah, I feel like the authors either forgot to write an ending or, as I choose to believe as an internal optimist, placed it there 20 years ago in hopes that I would one day stumble upon it. And so I decided to create my own ending. I never thought when planning out this series that I'd be able to organically add a homebrew, but it seems the research gods have smiled upon me in return for my time investment reading countless old D&D books. And just to be crystal clear here, the stories I have shared thus far are published canon from official 3rd edition sources. But the following is my rumor, which, if you follow the Nine Hells series at all, you will know it's kind of my informal code word for homebrew. But this definitely required an ending, so take it for what you will, or hey, maybe create your own ending and share it with me. So as I conclude this final legend, I wanted to create a scenario that might make for a fun campaign component. To that end, the continued and prolonged hibernation cycles of the surviving Mahershala Sarrukh would obviously need to be accommodated by some form of pretty powerful magic, perhaps through one of the deities such as the World Serpent, or maybe this surviving lot had a group of powerful mages among them like in the previous legend. In any event, it'd be critical that they find a location in which they could hibernate for 1,000 years without discovery, which in and of itself is not an easy task. And it's here that you could place them in any number of remote but fun and notable Forgotten Realms locations and kind of roll the dice. The Lost Peaks, the Shadowdale Caverns, the ruins of Mythotrinor. Heck, put them in the Beateth Fortress in the High Forest. But if I ever have an opportunity to actually run this as an adventure, these surviving Sarrukh will have developed the ability to enter and remain in the ethereal plane indefinitely, sort of like the Night Hag's etherealness power. And in this plane is where they would hibernate, only coming out once every 1,000 years as per the canon, where they would enter the realms in one of those remote places I just listed, where they would remain for a single year in order to gather resources, procreate, and birth their offspring, again, just like the canon indicates. And of course, it would be in that year that they are awakened and upon the realms that your adventure, or my adventure, would take place. Having a full year would give the world building an appropriate time to make this part of a longer campaign if you wish, or use it as a standalone adventure. Now, by the time the Sarrukh empires fell, they were clearly an evil race. In fact, some would argue they were always an evil race. So no additional motive is really required here, but for my table, if I was to run this, I'd add a plot device, and I would add a more insidious ability, perhaps allowing select members of the remaining clan to enter and manipulate the dreams of others. Remember, they're procreating each millennia for however many millennia, so they're presumably growing into a rather strong or large community and achieving this form of semi-immortality, perhaps aided by whichever World Serpent deity is appropriate. Their mages could be empowered and end up quite powerful. And to my way of thinking, their ultimate goal would be to somehow regain their dominant and sinister place in the realms, even so many millennia later. So by subtly influencing the course of history through the dreams of political and military leaders or heroes and villainous powers, they could become unseen puppet masters, looking to reshape the fate of nations and kings, which at least for me would give me a full palette of creative tools with which to build something really unique, memorable, and fun for my table. In fact, I think I might complete this and put it out in PDF form on my Patreon. If you're a member and you think it's a worthwhile adventure, be sure to let me know. And if you have any ideas, I'd love to read them, so make sure you leave a comment. We will close out Volume 2 with the story of the Batrachi Empire, and oh boy, look at the time. This should probably be called the Sarrukh episode, but hey, that's what you get when you end up in second place. While the Sarrukh empires rose to glory and fell to despair, the Batrachi civilization, a name derived from the ancient Greek word batrakos for frog, began their development along a very different path. The earliest origins of the Batrachi are traced to the abundant seas and oceans of the realms. Evolving the ability to breathe both air and water, they gradually adapted to thrive in the brackish swamps, fens, mangroves, and estuaries that crisscrossed the very young Abir Torel. As early as negative 34,800 DR, Batrachi communities appeared along the mild northern coast of the Black Sea, known as the Fertile Crescent. In contrast to the many races competing for the arid plains and grasslands, the Batrachi thrived along these fertile marshes and littorals of the land. With abundant shellfish sustaining dense populations, these amphibious beings and the ancestors of such future races as bullywugs, kuo-toa, merfolk, and doppelgangers began to undergo a metamorphosis, emerging from the waters to walk upon the land, and they would, in time, find their place upon this new world, settling in permanent villages and growing into a sprawling civilization. The Batrachi timing also proved to be quite fortuitous. Around negative 33,400 DR, as the Sarrukh dominance began to wane, the Batrachi seized the opportunity in securing not only their survival, but their ability to thrive in a time of lowered competition. Unlike the serpentine and mysterious Sarrukh, the early Batrachi were more tribal and somewhat barbaric, but also possessed latent magical potential, a hint at their unique path in which their future would tread. Some sources theorize the Batrachi possessed an innate talent for shape-shifting in tandem with their amphibious forms, giving the race a strong environmental advantage. Whatever their exact origins, we know the Batrachi grew dominant across the scattered coastal enclaves as the last Sarrukh empires faded. Their numbers and sophistication swelled in the wetlands left abandoned by the once dominant Serpent kings who favored arid climes and, of course, the inlands. Taking full advantage, within a mere century of settling upon land, the Batrachi began to display their remarkable aptitude for magic. They adopted and advanced the Sarrukh system of cuneiform writing and became early masters of conjuring and transmutation ritual magic. The Batrachi empires rose to power circa negative 33,500 DR, and they did so by outcompeting and out-expanding the Yuan Tai, the new servitor leaders of the overthrown empire of Mahershala, ensuring they would never achieve the heights of their captors, the Sarrukh. As they entered their own golden age, the Batrachi contributions to the development of the ancient magics of this era can really not be overstated. Like the Sarrukh before them and the Are after them, the Batrachi continued efforts to further advance the knowledge captured in those golden skins of the world serpent directly led to the creation of the Hall of Mists, the vault of Beoteth's sages we covered in Chapter 5. And it was in that arcane stronghold hidden deep in the high forest where Batrachi mages significantly influenced the development of the Beoteth writings, which would later evolve into the Nether Scrolls, that treasure trove of fundamental magical knowledge. In fact, it is from the Hall of Mists, discovered so many millennia later, where a not insignificant portion of our historical record on the Batrachi, their gods, and their study of ancient magic were collected. While the historical records suggest that the Sarrukh predominantly worshipped a single deity, at least in name, one they called the World Serpent and attributed to so many deities or aspects, with the Batrachi there exists a myriad of separate deities that each claim to have held a portion of their populace under sway at one point or another, all generally tied to one of the latter races from which the Batrachi are the known ancestor. These include the kuo-toa goddess, the bloodthirsty sea mother, Blutdulpu, who also is called the drowning goddess, and the bullywig primordial deity, Ramenos, referred to as the sleeping god, who is also seen on occasion depicted in a drunken stupor. There's also some evidence placing the merfolk deity Iedro in the Batrachi pantheon. Written accounts dating back to negative 12,500 DR tell of art recovered within those Hall of Mists by elven explorers of the time, which depict Batrachi godlike kings and warriors as towering frogmen with slick, wet skin and lean, muscular frames. At their height, the Batrachi Empire spread across the whole of the supercontinent of Meroboros and included the realms of Naz-de-Da, Kolufun, Boy-Tumelo, and Jokodian, named after their historic leader, who was both credited with the rise of their empire and perhaps their fall as well. Under the leadership of Jokodian, also known as the High One, Batrachi power reached its zenith around negative 31,500 DR, holding the now Yuan Tai-controlled Mahershala in check while attempting to expand their own dominions by launching campaigns of conquest in the north against the domain of Astoria, also known as the Colossal Kingdom. Astoria is Jotun speak for father's seat, and was the original kingdom of the giant race called the Titans, but not to be confused with the Dawn Titans. These progenitors of today's giants were created and led by their deity, Anum the Allfather, and were far more powerful than the giants of today. This Titan-like race typically stood over 25 foot tall, which puts all the ancestor giants of this age around the size of today's storm giants, making up for their lack of numbers with sheer strength and power, a formidable foe to be sure, which the Batrachi would soon discover. Astoria and the story of the giants and their tangles with the dragons of the realm will definitely be covered in a later volume. Regardless, the fateful Batrachi decision of expansion through war against the Jotun brood would mark the end of the Batrachi Golden Age and the start of their decline as they battled the Titans in an ever-losing battle. This decline began sometime around negative 31,400 DR, where ancient texts from both the Batrachi and the Jotun brood confirm that during this war, Joko Dian was killed by a Titan Thane named Omo. Unlike our historical recounting of the fall of the Sarrukh Empire taking place over many centuries, the fall of the Batrachi Empire was practically instantaneous when examined through the long lens of history. But it's not their defeat at the hands of Amun's brood that is most historical about the Batrachi. That dishonor might fall to another of their ill-fated decisions near the end of the war. I say might because it is one of several divergent mythologies, and one that is not without significant controversy. It is a version of the cataclysmic event that would come to be known as the Tearfall, which we will cover along with the avian creators known as the Are in Volume 3. And that concludes Volume 2, a long one I know, and that's after 4 content cuts. Maybe I'll rename it the Sarrukh Show, but come on, don't tell me you didn't learn something new today. But we're still very, very early in our journey with so much more to come, so please join me in Volume 3, where we will cap off the Days of Thunder with one of the most impactful events of all time. Bad pun intended. What, too soon? Plus, we will profile the rise and fall of the avian ancestors known as the Are, setting us up with a time of dragons. I hope you were entertained and or learned something new today and had as much fun watching as I had researching and sharing. If you'd like to support the channel, please check out the links below, and if you think I earned it, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening, and until next time, remember, the only limitation at your table is your imagination.